Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, where I get a chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. This broadcast is sponsored by Reveal Brainspace, the industry's leading AI eDiscovery platform. Don't forget to subscribe to watch me, George Socha, weekly with leaders in eDiscovery. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. I am George Socha. I head up brand awareness at Reveal. On each episode of eDiscovery Leaders Live, I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. Past episodes are available on the Reveal website. Go to revealdata.com, select resources, then select eDiscovery Leaders Live. I'm broadcasting today from Reveal's headquarters in downtown Chicago. If there is noise, background noise from the trains rumbling by, that's the explanation for it. Hopefully, it won't be too disruptive. Our guest this week is TracyAnn Eggen. Tracy currently consults on internal corporate practices and tech stack purchases. We'll get into all of that and a lot more. TracyAnn, welcome.
Thanks, George, for having me. Looking forward to our chat.
Oh, it should be good. I'd like to start out by having you set the stage for us a bit by telling you how it is you got to where you are and learned about how to do what you do.
Well, I started off in a law firm as a paralegal. And then I really did a hard kind of pivot in developing teams and selecting, tech on what we were doing internally for the law firm. I just kind of had a gift of, going from paper and the books to researching things to really being able to take evidence and put it into the different things like summation and concordance in the old days and be able to find kind of the real nuts and bolts of really what made the case. And then I moved pretty much into consulting and standing up boutique practices for different heavy hitting partners who decided to go out on their own and hang out their own shingle. And then ultimately went into corporate where I built a whole program out for a large healthcare organization, was at a brief time at a startup. And so that's kind of how I got started.
I'd like to focus in on then today that in-house e-discovery portion of it and what it means to those managing teams or being part of a team, an e-discovery team at a corporation.
I think it still is not as well understood within the corporate environment. Even in large corporations, there's a lot of change that are going on. And just from the corporate lens, legal is more, and risk, and mitigation of risk is really still a reactionary to event in a corporation. And so I think sometimes people are looking at building everything out in a year or building everything out in a couple years. But I think to do things with stability and that they are repeatable and defensible, and you really have an eye to developing people's career, you really have to have kind of a 5-year plan. And there's so much great tech that's out there. And I think that's also part of the issue for people who are purchasing it now.
In today's environment where the tech changes so rapidly, where the structure of things seems to keep morphing, how do you put together and then follow a 5-year plan? It feels sometimes like a 5-minute plan is asking too much.
You bring up a really good point. There are obviously just standards in the legal hold and preservation process where you can take manual processes where you're not dependent on IT. You can build that kind of automation. You also can leverage non-technical and technical resources. By what I mean is if you have a first-year paralegal, if you have an executive assistant who wants to learn and take part in that, if you want to bridge the gap between legal, compliance, risk, HR from the investigation front, you really have some very definitive steps that people take in an organization. And so you start off sort of at that basic run up. Legal hold is always going to be important. Preserving it and knowing that it's locked and loaded when you need it and it's going to be there. And then also just bringing those departments together to bring some harmony to investigations so that if you do have an audit or there is something else in a regulatory arm, you have some defensibility behind that.
In my experience, in a lot of corporations, they have at best one person who has e-discovery as a focus, and that might not be that person's sole focus. Sometimes that's someone who's been a practicing lawyer. More often, I think it's someone who's been a paralegal. How does all of that work? I mean, 5-year plan, half a person, diverse corporate. How does that work together?
It's a really good question. And I do think that that's where you're leveraging people who have time and an interest to learn. Because when you start to build synergy, not only in your own department, but people buy into that process, they take a sense of ownership and pride in that. Really don't need somebody that's an e-discovery specialist who understands processing, how you do exception handling, and they're handling really that kind of right side of the EDRM. You don't need someone that strategic in those initial processes. So I'm always like, teach a friend, partner with how those things are going. And as you deliver value, which we're not really great at, we're not like, okay, we just, crank through 100 cases. We review the information. We had a great risk posture because we don't do legal QBRs that have to do with risk or claims or pre-litigation or litigation cases. We're just glad it's off of our plate. So I'm always game as like, you've got to build your community. And as those things start to reach out, then people get interested in what you're doing. But one person, and depending on your run rate, is not necessarily going to build out success or get the interest of the stakeholders.
What then does it take?
I think you need to show your value. And how do we do that? That's one of the biggest parts of, I think, legal discovery, investigations, forensic work, that we don't have these swift dashboards. We're taking information, we're developing pivot tables. You have to partner with people. You need to develop relationships across your organization. You need to know the person in identity management who's running that team so that if you want to stand something up, you have a go-to person who's going to help you get it over the line quickly. You need to make sure you know who's running cybersecurity, or you have a buddy who's a data security analyst that says, I got you covered, TA. I'm going to talk to my boss and I'm going to get you, through this project. So I think those portions of it, and then you need internal stakeholders. And really, it's about money. How can I show better efficiency, cost savings, and a reduction of outside counsel spend?
As you talk through that, it sounds to me that as much as anything else, this is a sales role, an internal sales role. I'm missing something here.
It's a sales cheerleader, rah-rah, I think it has to do also that we have a lot of redundancy in tech in corporate. Compliance has their Compliance 360 that runs all their investigations and everything else. Risk has their own thing because they handle a certain portion of claims that are under insurance coverage. And then you have legal that are handling kind of like business contract disputes, operational disputes. They're manning operations across the organization and consulting so they can reduce risk. So now you have a redundancy of all these different applications. And then if you're fortunate and cyber has a forensic sort of, pen testing, other type of team, now you're gaining that synergy there with that team, but you're always dealing with IT in some type of structure. So I think that part of it is pretty much like, I've got to sell this, and this is how I can show that it gives value. And just as an example, when we went to go decommission across our organization different tools, one of the guys who loved this tool was like, can you tell me how you use this? I mean, this is at the point because he really has doubled down on this vendor and he knows the pain process of implementing something else in his environment. He's like, can you tell me what we use this for? And I gave him a fact-based case on what we used it for. And he's like, wow, I never really thought of that. And that single conversation between professionals was something he could take back to his leadership and say, oh, we do have a substantial use case for this that is actually going to help the bottom line.
So if you have been fortunate enough to have just been hired into a corporation to help them build out their e-discovery capabilities, whatever they mean by that, because I'm assuming most corporations have little to nothing on that front. Where do you start?
I think you need to listen to your people and your team. I think no strategic changes should you be making in the first 60 days because you're just there learning on what's going on. And you're having soft conversations with the vendors that you already have to say, these are some of the things that I'm getting back as feedback, and we're going to need to partner so that we can move this agenda forward and I can build out a more robust program. I think a lot of people come into roles and they already have a mindset of where they've been successful in other similar roles in other companies and organizations. And so they already have their blinders on to sort of look to say, this is what I'm going to do here because I was successful there. And that's not always the case.
So start out inquiry, find out what's going on, what the needs are. As you start to get that information gathered together, then what?
I think you need to invite the people who are really doing the work to the table about tech. I'm a big person about, like, you can throw up a sandbox and everything can work beautifully in the sandbox until you kind of get it into your environment, and then you're understanding the complications not only with your environment, but you're understanding the complications of the anticipation of what you and expectations that you had from this particular application. And there is sort of massaging it through there. And there are some learning points that maybe didn't, because e-discovery is such a niche area and it's extremely important to the organization. We want to get the data, we want to get through the data, we want to look at the data. I think that part of it is that you really need to investigate and you need to spend 6 months to a year looking at an application, and it needs to be a pilot. But our whole idea is like, we're going to send out this RFP that honestly, even our leadership doesn't understand what it means. And they're questions that, as someone skilled in the art, I'm like, well, what are they asking? So I think that part of it, and really testing it, because you can get something in there and it doesn't exactly work the way you need it to be. And you need to be very precise. What are the top 3 pain points that you need solved right away? Everybody's complaining by the water cooler about them. Nobody wants to do the work for that. And is there an objective here that you can relieve the stress off the people who you are with?
So you've got, it sounds like 3 parts that you've got to manage in this, at least. One is to determine what to do on the technological front. What tools do you want to have available to be used? The second is who's going to use those tools and how? And a third is where do outside counsel fit in this mix? Let's start with the first, the tools.
I think with the tools, I think the learning curve for people, they want to be able to move into something and transition that application for success. So if there's a lot of, we have to implement, we need to partner, we need to communicate the message, and then we need to successfully handhold that over the next 6 months for people to become more comfortable with that application. And then we're going to have to take that rainbow effect of the people that just are always going to kind of complain because that's part of their nature. And where is the hallmark of, like, is this a successful deployment?
How do you go
That's
about
an on-prem.
Yeah.
If you're
Okay.
talking about an e-discovery vendor, you
Mm-hmm.
know, there are some hallmarks that all e-discovery vendors deliver. They take your information, they process it, they have a SaaS and you push it through and process it. You look at exceptions. If you're going to leverage AI in this review, getting the review team, how much are you really looking at? Is there an absence of information, meaning communications have been taken off the corporate channel? So those are all sort of those hallmark things. And are they systematically responsive and delivering for you in your deadlines and pretty much every single time?
And then throw the law firms in the mix.
That throws the law firms into the mix because law firms by nature are like, I'm I'm comfortable right here. Even when we've had historical big companies who've been around, you would be surprised how many people still do not have a level of sophistication of getting into a review space and being able to do what they need to do. So managing that anxiety, especially since the lawyer has their bar license on the line, they want to deliver back to the client, they want more work from the client, they want to look good. So a lot of times they're coming to e-discovery specialists, either in-house or external, saying things like, I am looking for. So you can't complicate that. If you're asking them to pivot to something that is going to affect a high percentage of their junior attorneys and their senior attorneys for review, you really need to be able to bring down anxiety and make sure they know that you're going to be there across the process.
So let's step back then to the technology once more and think as well about the providers and what this does on the law firm front. But first is, how do you go about determining what technology you want to use?
You need to determine how much you want to bring in-house and how much you want to outsource. I'm a firm believer that if people in-house are managing and they enjoy the technology, they feel good about it when they get in there. They're not starting the beads of sweat because they're like, how do I do this? Or I don't remember this, or this was complicated search. Whatever that happens to be, you first have to decide what you want to bring in-house and what you want to outsource. I'm the kind of person like, I don't need someone to push a bunch of buttons and load data. We have people who can do that internally in-house. I want to pay for people who are smarter than me. I want to pay for them saying, hey, did you take a look at this? We ran a couple other, camel models through BrainSpace, and why don't you take a look at this part right here? I think we have a gap here, or I think this might be interesting to you. Bringing back information to me that's going to make me smarter and my team smarter. And then always constantly kind of looking towards how we can get in and out of what we need and how you can set up a quarterly QBR with me that says we've had these 50 cases. This is where your average is at. And this is how much data you're reviewing. And then as you start doing that, you start showing value of the team because now you're looking at it. You've reduced outside spend. You're supporting a full life cycle for that technology and for that process. And your people are happier because they're not working overtime because you can outsource part of that.
So you mentioned a QBR. What does that mean?
I think that it's a quarterly review. People who develop products and applications are in tech. They do this as a service to see where you're at. Are you meeting your roadmap objectives? Did you overpromise and underdeliver? Are you having some kind of, latency? Is the application having some small outages that are impacting business processes? But as legal professionals, this is not something that happens. We don't ask our outside counsel to come back every quarter and give a rundown of all the cases that settled. We don't talk to them about, legal doesn't even review those applications. They give it to a project manager who takes in feedback, provides it to the vendor analyzes that and decides what they need to do, and then comes back with either solutions or just part of that conversation. And until we start running legal as a business, it's going to be harder and harder for us to partner and those partners to deliver for us, because anyone who has ever put a new application into a legal team knows the pain points internally of trying to get that over the line.
Why don't you, let's take a look at those pain points. For those who
One,
haven't been through that process.
well, sometimes people don't exactly test the application until you are chosen a vendor. And then the first time they've actually put eyes on it is in a meeting in which you are demoing the new application, what processes are now going to be covered, and what the learning curve and what their responsibility happens to be in their professional space. So if you don't test it in that meeting, I can tell you, you will have a lot of people in your department for the first time that will now come back and say, oh, well, I don't really like the interface. I thought it was going to do this. I thought I could click this button. And you're like, well, you had 6 months to kind of take a look at it. And this was something that was talked about. So those are type of things. And I think yearly pilots, because most of the time the testing is done in a 3-month period. The whole ramp up to that, because selling to corporate is a 12 to 18 month process. So if you ramp up to that, by the time the stakeholders have signed off, they're a very small portion of that group. So then now you have, 100 different lawyers, 200 lawyers, you have paralegals, you have risk compliance, other people coming in, and all of a sudden they're like, well, pump the brakes here, and that's a lot of massaging as you move forward. So I think if you go through a year pilot, you actually pay a portion of that for services. You get to really test in your environment, and when people are happy with it, which is part of that cheerleading sales position internally, then you can turn on the lights for the new application, and there's not as much of sort of that, massaging it through and that kind of kickback where people naturally are opposed to something new coming in.
Which comes first, the platform or the provider?
That's a good question. I would say both. If you have an existing provider or providers that you're happy with, and you want to build some kind of synergy, then I think it's really important that you ask around, or you have candid conversations with your provider about tech that you may or may not be bringing in. And because part of that pushing data out, you want to make sure that it doesn't disrupt processing in that critical path. So I think that's important. And if you're talking about APIs, you're talking about two technologies talking to each other, putting Power BI over it so you can bring up a Swift dashboard that at least your executive leadership can understand and it's been drilled down, I think you have to do both. And sometimes providers are resistant. They'll say, there's some things I want you to talk to some other people in our organization about their tech and where maybe some of the gray areas happen to be. And I think you need to listen to that. But ultimately, it's a partnership.
And then back to the earlier structure, it's a partnership not just with the tech provider, not just with the service provider, but with the law firm or firms. How do you successfully include law firms in this mix?
I think we have moved the pendulum a great deal. One, they tend to be resistant, especially if they have their own internal processes. It's just because they don't want to disrupt the harmony of how all their lawyers are practicing at that point, or how all of the teams are functioning together. So there is some discussion there. But I think outside counsel with role-based access also needs to be invited in. And you need them to, I wouldn't say donate, but somehow take part in the process of looking at how this is going to change the workflow from a corporate perspective and receiving work from organizations.
As we come close to the end of the time, what would be the key things that someone taking on a role like this in-house should be thinking as A, they consider about whether they take the role, and then B, as they start in the role?
I don't think that anything has changed in the last 20 years as far as accepting a role and what you can anticipate. Is the person that you're reporting up to, are they going to be a champion for you? Is the organization ready and ripe for change? What does your budget look like for that tech? And are they open for decommissioning in that sort of role? I think the other sort of questions really people should be asking if they're going into a role that has some type of magnitude, even if you're supporting your up chain, is why did the previous person leave? What are some of the pain points and struggles? And what is your roadmap in the next year that I need to deliver on?
Great. TracyAnn, thank you very much for joining us today. TracyAnn these days is consulting on internal corporate practices and tech stack purchases, if I could just speak clearly here. I am George Socha. This has been eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. TracyAnn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, George.